Welcome to Historical Legacies. Here, we dive into history's most intriguing stories, unraveling mysteries and uncovering truths from the past. Subscribe to join our journey through time's greatest moments. Ulysses S. Grant, the 18th President of the United States, remains a towering figure in American history. Born in humble circumstances, he rose to prominence as a determined military leader who played a critical role in preserving the Union during the Civil War. As president, Grant faced the challenges of rebuilding a fractured nation while navigating political turbulence and societal transformation. His life story intertwines perseverance, triumph, and moments of profound difficulty, making him one of the most compelling figures of the 19th century. Part 1. Early Life and Humble Beginnings. Ulysses S. Grant was born on April 27, 1822, in Point Pleasant, Ohio, as Hiram Ulysses Grant. His father, Jesse Root Grant, was a hardworking tanner and businessman who expected his children to follow his industrious example. His mother, Hannah Simpson Grant, was quiet, religious, and deeply devoted to raising their 6 children. Ulysses, their firstborn son, grew up in modest circumstances that taught him the value of perseverance and simplicity. The family relocated to Georgetown, Ohio, when Ulysses was a toddler, providing him with a stable but unremarkable childhood. As a boy, Ulysses developed an extraordinary talent for handling horses. By the age of 7, he was trusted to manage teams of horses and handle important tasks for local farmers. His natural affinity for animals earned him respect in the community, and it later became a defining skill in his military career. Unlike his peers, Ulysses was quiet and introverted, often preferring solitary tasks to social activities. He showed little interest in his father's tanning business, much to Jesse Grant's disappointment. Instead, Ulysses enjoyed the outdoors, often spending time fishing, riding horses, or helping on local farms. Education was important to the Grants, and Jesse made sure his children attended local schools. Although Ulysses was not an exceptional student, he displayed a keen memory and practical intelligence. His reserved nature often led teachers and peers to underestimate him, but he quietly excelled in areas that interested him. His father, recognizing his aversion to the tanning trade, sought to secure a brighter future for his son. In 1839, Jesse arranged for Ulysses to attend the United States Military Academy at West Point, a decision that would change the trajectory of his life. The nomination to West Point came with an accidental alteration to his name. The congressman who submitted the paperwork mistakenly recorded his name as Ulysses S. Grant instead of Hiram Ulysses Grant. Unwilling to risk rejection, Ulysses adopted the new name, later joking that the S stood for nothing. His time at West Point was unremarkable academically, as he graduated 21st out of 39 cadets in 1843. However, he was renowned for his skill with horses, earning accolades as the best horseman at the academy. This talent foreshadowed his ability to command cavalry and manage logistics during his military career. After graduation, Grant was assigned to Jefferson Barracks in Missouri, where he performed routine military duties. It was here that he met Julia Dent, the sister of a fellow officer. The two became deeply attached, and despite the challenges of military life, they married in 1848 after a lengthy courtship. Julia's unwavering support and optimism became a stabilizing force in Grant's life. Though Grant showed talent and discipline, he struggled with ambition in his early career. He viewed his military service as a means of stability rather than a path to greatness. His modest goals and quiet demeanor reflected his upbringing, shaped by his parents' values of humility, hard work, and practicality. These formative years reveal a man of contradictions, a shy, unassuming boy with remarkable talents that often went unnoticed. Grant's early experiences with responsibility, his connection to ordinary people, and his ability to adapt to difficult circumstances would define his approach to leadership in both war and politics. The lessons of his childhood and youth laid the foundation for a future that neither he nor his family could have anticipated. His rise from modest beginnings to one of the most pivotal figures in American history began quietly, shaped by his resilience and understated determination. Part 2. Service in the Mexican-American War. Ulysses S. Grant's military career truly began with the Mexican-American War, which broke out in 1846. Although he initially viewed military service as a practical obligation rather than a passion, the war provided him with invaluable experience that honed his leadership and strategic abilities. At the time, Grant was serving as a quartermaster in the 4th Infantry Regiment, responsible for managing supplies and logistics. His role kept him away from direct combat initially, but it also allowed him to study the movements of troops and the tactics of seasoned leaders. Grant served under two prominent generals during the war, Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott. He admired Taylor's calm demeanor and straightforward approach, which left a lasting impression on his own leadership style. Taylor's ability to make decisive yet pragmatic choices resonated with Grant, who later emulated these qualities in his own commands. Meanwhile, Winfield Scott, known for his methodical planning and attention to detail, exposed Grant to the importance of preparation and coordination in warfare. Observing these contrasting leadership styles helped shape Grant's approach to military strategy, balancing decisiveness with careful planning. Despite his logistical duties, Grant often volunteered for more dangerous assignments. He participated in battles such as Palo Alto, Resaca de la Palma, and Monterrey, gaining first-hand experience in the chaos and intensity of combat. His bravery and resourcefulness stood out, particularly during the Battle of Monterrey, where he carried a dispatch through enemy fire on horseback to relay crucial orders. This act of courage demonstrated his willingness to take risks for the greater good, a trait that would define his later career. The war also took Grant to the heart of Mexico, where he served under Scott during the campaign to capture Mexico City. He played a key role in battles at Veracruz, Cerro Gordo, and Molino del Rey, as well as in the final assault on Chapultepec Castle. During these engagements, Grant demonstrated tactical ingenuity and an ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. For instance, at Molino del Rey, he used an abandoned church steeple as a vantage point to direct artillery fire, showcasing his resourcefulness under pressure. While the Mexican-American War provided Grant with opportunities to prove himself, it also deepened his disillusionment with certain aspects of military life. He viewed the war as one driven by political ambition rather than necessity, and he expressed doubts about its moral justification. These sentiments reflected his broader perspective on the responsibilities of military leadership and the importance of serving a just cause. Grant returned from the war with a wealth of experience that would later prove critical during the Civil War. He had witnessed the complexities of large-scale military operations, learned how to manage troops effectively, and gained an understanding of the importance of supply lines and logistics. Moreover, his exposure to combat gave him confidence in his ability to lead under fire. Despite his modest rank, he had begun to develop the qualities that would make him a formidable general. The Mexican-American War was a transformative period in Grant's life. It marked the first time he faced the realities of war and tested his character in the field. The lessons he learned, both from his superiors and through his own experiences, shaped the leader he would become. Though still unassuming and reluctant to seek personal glory, Grant emerged from the war with a sharpened sense of duty and a clearer understanding of the sacrifices required to serve his country. This chapter in Grant's life provided him with a foundation of skills, insights, and resilience. These qualities would remain dormant for a time but would eventually resurface when the nation faced its greatest internal crisis, the Civil War. For now, Grant returned to a quieter life, unaware of the monumental role he would one day play in American history. Part 3. Life Between Wars. After the Mexican-American War, Ulysses S. Grant returned to a peacetime military role, but his life during this period was marked by challenges, frustrations, and self-discovery. Despite his accomplishments during the war, Grant found the post-war military to be monotonous and unfulfilling. Stationed at various remote outposts, including Detroit, Michigan, and later Sackett's Harbor, New York, he was far removed from the action and purpose he had experienced during wartime. The absence of meaningful duties and prolonged separation from his wife, Julia, took a toll on his morale and satisfaction with military life. In 1852, Grant was transferred to Fort Vancouver in the Oregon Territory, a post that exacerbated his difficulties. The isolation of the fort, combined with the harsh living conditions and long-distance separation from his family, weighed heavily on him. To supplement his meager military pay, Grant tried his hand at farming and other ventures but found little success. These financial pressures added to his growing sense of frustration. It was during this time that Grant began to drink, a habit that would later spark controversy and speculation about his character. In 1854, Grant was reassigned to Fort Humboldt in California, a remote and desolate post. His duties here were equally uninspiring, and his struggles with isolation and financial hardship intensified. That same year, facing mounting dissatisfaction and with little hope of advancement, Grant resigned from the Army. The decision marked a significant turning point in his life, as he left behind the only career he had known to seek a new path as a civilian. After resigning, Grant reunited with his family and attempted to build a stable life. He settled in St. Louis, Missouri, and tried farming on land owned by his father-in-law, calling the property hardscrabble. Despite his best efforts, the venture proved unsuccessful, as Grant lacked both the resources and the temperament to make the farm profitable. He later tried his hand at other jobs, including real estate and working as a clerk, but none provided financial stability. By 1860, Grant moved to Galena, Illinois, where he took a job in his father's leather goods store. While this position offered some stability, it was far from the life Grant had envisioned. The years leading up to the Civil War were marked by a sense of stagnation and unfulfilled potential. Despite these challenges, Grant maintained his resilience and dedication to his family, earning the respect of those who knew him personally. Grant's life during this period was a study in perseverance and humility. Though he faced repeated failures and setbacks, he never lost his work ethic or his quiet determination. These years taught him the value of persistence, resourcefulness, and adaptability, qualities that would later define his success as a military leader. The struggles he endured also shaped his empathy for ordinary Americans, as he shared in their hardships and understood their challenges firsthand. Unbeknownst to Grant, his fortunes were about to change dramatically. With the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, the skills, experiences, and character traits he had developed during these difficult years would finally find their purpose. His ability to adapt, endure, and lead under pressure would soon catapult him into the national spotlight. Grant's life between wars, though marked by hardship, ultimately became the crucible in which his resilience and strength of character were forged. This period, while often overlooked, was essential in shaping the man who would rise to meet the challenges of the Civil War. From the fields of hardscrabble to the streets of Galena, Grant's journey through adversity prepared him for the monumental role he would soon play in the preservation of the Union. Part 4: The Outbreak of the Civil War and Initial Steps. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 marked a pivotal moment in Ulysses S. Grant's life. Though he had spent much of his adult years in relative obscurity, the war suddenly created an opportunity for him to prove himself. Upon hearing about the conflict, Grant, now living in Galena, Illinois, immediately offered his services to the Union Army. His prior military experience and leadership potential were quickly recognized by local politicians, who encouraged him to volunteer. By June 1861, Grant had been appointed as the colonel of the 21st Illinois Volunteer Infantry Regiment. Grant's initial steps into the war were modest, but his experience and composure set him apart from many of his contemporaries. Unlike many officers, he had first-hand experience in battle, as well as a pragmatic, unpretentious approach to leadership. His regiment quickly saw action in Missouri, and Grant's early leadership was crucial in organizing and training the men under his command. His calm demeanor and ability to make decisions under pressure earned him the respect of both his subordinates and his superiors. His first major engagement came at the Battle of Belmont in November 1861, where he attempted to attack a Confederate force under General Leonidas Polk. Though the battle ended in a tactical draw, it served as a crucial test for Grant, who demonstrated his resolve, discipline, and capacity for decisive action. The battle marked Grant's emergence as a determined and effective commander, setting the stage for his rapid rise through the ranks. Despite the lack of a clear victory, Grant's ability to learn from mistakes and adapt his strategy impressed his superiors. By early 1862, Grant had been promoted to brigadier general and was given command of Union forces in the western theater of the war. He took command of a small force near Fort Henry in Tennessee, and his success in capturing the fort in February of that year was a significant early victory for the Union Army. It was during the subsequent Battle of Fort Donelson, just a few days later, that Grant earned his first major recognition and his famous nickname, Unconditional Surrender Grant. In the Battle of Fort Donelson, Grant laid siege to the Confederate stronghold, demanding unconditional surrender from General Simon Bolivar Buckner, a former West Point classmate. When Buckner asked for terms of surrender, Grant's terse reply, "No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works," became famous across the country. The victory was a turning point, not only for Grant but for the morale of the Union Army, which had previously suffered a series of setbacks in the war's early days. Following his success at Fort Donelson, Grant was promoted to Major General, a position that would see him commanding larger forces and facing more significant challenges. His rise was meteoric, and his willingness to take risks, fight hard, and maintain a steady hand under pressure made him a favorite of President Abraham Lincoln. The Union had found a general who was willing to go after the Confederacy with relentless determination, qualities that set Grant apart from many of his contemporaries, who were often bogged down by indecision or overly cautious strategies. By the spring of 1862, Ulysses S. Grant had emerged as one of the Union Army's brightest stars. The victories at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson had placed him at the forefront of the war effort, and his tactical ingenuity and refusal to back down would soon propel him into larger campaigns and greater responsibility. Grant's quiet, confident leadership, tempered by a practical understanding of war's realities, ensured that he would become the key figure in the Union's Western campaigns. His role as a military leader would only grow from here, as the war escalated and Grant's command would be tested on even greater battlefields. The early stages of the Civil War marked a defining moment in Grant's life. His rise from relative obscurity to a commanding general was fast, but his path was a result of his steady determination, courage, and ability to seize opportunities. These qualities, cultivated in his earlier military and civilian life, had prepared him for the most critical phase of the Civil War, where his leadership would prove instrumental in determining the Union's fate. Part 5. The Battle of Shiloh and Gaining National Attention. The Battle of Shiloh, fought in April 1862, became one of the most pivotal and brutal engagements of the American Civil War, marking a turning point in Ulysses S. Grant's career and the Union's military strategy. For Grant, the battle was not only a test of his leadership under pressure, but also a harsh lesson in the realities of war. Prior to Shiloh, Grant's successes at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson had solidified his reputation as a determined and capable commander. However, the Battle of Shiloh would bring both intense scrutiny and a deeper understanding of the challenges facing the Union Army. The Union Army, under Grant's command, had moved southward along the Tennessee River, aiming to secure key Confederate positions in the region. On April 6, 1862, the Confederate Army, led by General Albert Sidney Johnston and General P.G.T. Beauregard, launched a surprise attack on Grant's forces near Shiloh Church in southwestern Tennessee. The Union soldiers, unprepared for the ferocity of the attack, were initially overwhelmed, suffering heavy casualties. Grant, however, refused to panic, and he quickly reorganized his troops, directing them to hold their ground while reinforcements were called for. The fighting on the first day was fierce and bloody, with both sides suffering enormous losses. By the evening, it seemed as though the Confederates might have gained the upper hand, but Grant's resolve remained unshaken. He refused to retreat or abandon his position, and on the following day, Union reinforcements under General Don Carlos Buell arrived, turning the tide of the battle. With fresh troops and a renewed sense of determination, Grant's forces launched a counterattack, pushing the Confederate Army back and ultimately forcing them to retreat. The Union victory at Shiloh came at a heavy cost. More than 23,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing, making it one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War up to that point. The staggering loss of life shocked both the North and the South, forcing a reevaluation of the war's brutal nature. The battle also raised questions about Grant's leadership, with critics blaming him for being caught off guard and allowing such a devastating surprise attack. Despite the criticism, Grant's handling of the aftermath demonstrated the qualities that would become his hallmark as a leader. He took full responsibility for the battle's outcome, acknowledging his errors but also asserting his belief in the necessity of aggressive action against the Confederacy. Grant's refusal to be deterred by the criticism, coupled with his commitment to the Union cause, strengthened his position as a trusted military leader. President Abraham Lincoln, who had been following the battle's developments closely, stood by Grant, recognizing that his willingness to keep fighting despite the odds was an asset to the Union Army. Shiloh also marked the beginning of Grant's transformation into a more tactical and strategic leader. In the aftermath of the battle, Grant began to focus on improving his army's preparedness and organization, ensuring that his troops would never again be caught off guard in such a catastrophic manner. His experience at Shiloh also deepened his understanding of the importance of fortifications, logistics, and clear communication during combat. The Battle of Shiloh catapulted Ulysses S. Grant into the national spotlight. While the high casualties and the initial setbacks at the beginning of the battle prompted criticism, his steadfast leadership and ultimate victory transformed him into a symbol of Union resolve. His refusal to retreat, even in the face of overwhelming odds, earned him widespread respect and admiration, while his critics began to soften their stance as his unwavering commitment to victory became clear. The battle's outcome solidified his reputation as a general who could endure tremendous losses and continue to push forward for the Union's success. Shiloh, though costly, proved that Grant had the mettle to lead the Union Army in its long and grueling war against the Confederacy. It was a battle that marked the beginning of a new phase in his military career, one where his decisive leadership would be pivotal in the ultimate defeat of the South. From Shiloh forward, Grant's reputation as a relentless and resilient commander would continue to grow, setting the stage for even larger campaigns that would change the course of American history. Part 6. The Siege of Vicksburg and Grant's Strategic Genius. After the Battle of Shiloh, Ulysses S. Grant's focus shifted toward the Mississippi River, a critical strategic objective for the Union Army. The Confederacy controlled a long stretch of the river, which effectively split the Union in two and provided vital supply lines for Confederate forces. Grant recognized that controlling the Mississippi River would be a crucial step toward breaking the Confederacy's ability to wage war, and he set his sights on the fortified city of Vicksburg, Mississippi. Vicksburg was located on a high bluff overlooking the Mississippi River, making it a natural defensive stronghold for the Confederacy. Its location along a bend in the river made it nearly impossible to capture through conventional means, and General John C. Pemberton's Confederate forces there had constructed extensive fortifications. Grant knew that capturing Vicksburg would require not just military might but a combination of patience, innovation, and strategic ingenuity. In the winter of 1862 to 1863, Grant initiated a campaign to isolate Vicksburg, employing a series of daring maneuvers and operations to bypass the city's defenses and cut off its supply routes. He attempted several direct assaults on the city, but each was repelled with heavy losses. Realizing the futility of conventional tactics, Grant changed his approach, deciding to isolate Vicksburg through a prolonged siege. By late May 1863, Grant's forces had successfully encircled the city, cutting off any hope of Confederate reinforcements or supplies reaching Vicksburg. Over the course of several weeks, Grant's men subjected the city to a relentless bombardment, shelling the Confederate fortifications and using their superior artillery to wear down the defenders. At the same time, Grant continued to tighten the siege, preventing any escape for the defenders. Pemberton's forces inside Vicksburg, unable to break the siege or receive reinforcements, faced dire conditions. Food and supplies dwindled, and the Confederate soldiers, along with the civilian population, were forced to seek shelter in caves and trenches to escape the constant bombardment. Grant's siege strategy was a testament to his patience and resolve, as he understood that Vicksburg would fall only when the defenders could no longer sustain themselves. The Confederate surrender came on July 4, 1863, after more than 6 weeks of siege, marking a decisive victory for Grant and the Union Army. The fall of Vicksburg had enormous strategic implications, as it gave the Union complete control of the Mississippi River, effectively splitting the Confederacy in two. Grant's success at Vicksburg demonstrated his strategic genius, his ability to adapt to the situation, and his determination to achieve his objectives at any cost. The victory at Vicksburg elevated Grant to national prominence and was seen as one of the most significant Union successes of the Civil War. It solidified his reputation as a general capable of executing complex, high-risk operations with remarkable discipline and effectiveness. The fall of Vicksburg, combined with the Union's victory at Gettysburg just a day earlier, marked a turning point in the war, as the Confederacy's hopes of winning began to diminish. Grant's success at Vicksburg also solidified his standing with President Abraham Lincoln, who had become increasingly frustrated with some of his generals' lack of decisiveness. Lincoln had previously questioned whether Grant was the right man to lead the Union Army, but his unrelenting pursuit of victory and his triumph at Vicksburg silenced many of his critics. The victory cemented Grant's reputation as a leader who was not afraid to take risks, and his ability to conduct a siege of such complexity was a testament to his military acumen. The Siege of Vicksburg was a pivotal moment in the Civil War, and Ulysses S. Grant's leadership during this operation was a major factor in the Union's eventual victory. It demonstrated his capacity to think beyond conventional strategies, his unwavering commitment to the Union cause, and his ability to adapt to the changing nature of warfare. From this point on, Grant's name was synonymous with the Union's military successes, and his status as one of the greatest generals of the war was firmly established. The victory at Vicksburg not only gave the Union a significant military advantage, but also dealt a severe blow to the Confederate Army's ability to sustain its war effort. Grant's strategic genius, patience, and relentless pursuit of his objectives had shattered a key Confederate stronghold, paving the way for the Union's eventual triumph. Part 7. The Rise to Command and the 1864 Campaigns. Following his decisive victory at Vicksburg, Ulysses S. Grant's fortunes continued to rise, and his strategic brilliance began to attract national attention. By the summer of 1863, Grant had become the general-in-chief of all Union armies, a position that placed him at the helm of the Union war effort. His rise to the top came after President Abraham Lincoln, impressed by Grant's aggressive tactics and results, replaced several of his cautious and indecisive generals with Grant. This promotion was a turning point, not just in Grant's career but in the trajectory of the war itself. As General-in-Chief, Grant inherited the responsibility of overseeing all military operations across the country. The Union Army, now under a single cohesive command, needed a unified strategy to achieve victory against the Confederacy. With his proven track record of leadership and success, Grant set out to bring a coordinated, aggressive strategy to the front lines, one that would involve multiple fronts and require relentless pursuit of the Confederate Army. His focus was not just on winning individual battles, but on breaking the Confederate Army's ability to fight as a unified force. In the Eastern Theater, Grant confronted General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, the Confederacy's most formidable force. Grant knew that the key to defeating the Confederacy lay in wearing down Lee's army and cutting off the Confederacy's resources, thus forcing a decisive conclusion to the war. To do this, he knew he would need to continuously engage Lee's forces and prevent them from retreating to safer positions where they could regroup. Grant began his 1864 campaign with the Overland Campaign, a series of battles designed to engage Lee directly and prevent him from escaping into the southern heartland. The first clash, the Battle of the Wilderness, took place in early May 1864 in dense forests near Fredericksburg, Virginia. The battle was marked by brutal, close-quarters fighting, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Grant's forces fought Lee to a standstill, but Grant refused to retreat, a marked contrast to previous Union commanders who had withdrawn in the face of heavy losses. Instead, Grant chose to press on, continuing the fight despite the mounting casualties. The fighting in the wilderness was intense, with fires breaking out during the battle and many soldiers becoming trapped by the flames. Despite the horrific losses, Grant continued to push forward, engaging Lee's forces again at the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse later that month. Throughout the Overland Campaign, Grant's determination to engage Lee at every opportunity was clear. He would never give Lee the time or space to regroup. Grant's strategy was not to win every battle, but to relentlessly pursue Lee's army, forcing him into a prolonged war of attrition. The Overland Campaign was marked by several bloody engagements, including the Battle of Cold Harbor in early June, where Grant's forces suffered a disastrous assault with high casualties. The defeat was devastating, and many Union soldiers and civilians questioned Grant's leadership after the loss. Grant, however, never wavered in his belief that the war could only be won through persistence and attrition. His strategy, though costly in terms of lives, was beginning to bear fruit, as Lee's army was slowly being worn down, losing men and supplies with each engagement. While the Eastern Theater saw brutal fighting, the Western Theater, under Grant's direction, was also making significant strides. The Union's forces were pushing forward in Georgia and the Carolinas, securing victories that further divided the Confederate states. General William Tecumseh Sherman, operating under Grant's orders, began his famous march through Georgia, capturing key Confederate cities and significantly weakening the Confederate hold on the South. This simultaneous pressure on the Confederacy from multiple directions was a critical part of Grant's overall strategy to end the war as quickly as possible. By late 1864, Grant's relentless pursuit of Lee's forces, combined with the Union victories in the West, had placed the Confederacy on the defensive. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was being gradually pushed back, and the Confederacy's ability to replenish its troops and supplies was dwindling. Despite the high cost of lives and the toll on soldiers, Grant's leadership ensured that the Union Army remained relentless, refusing to allow any Confederate victories to go unchallenged. His dogged determination, even in the face of personal and public criticism, became a defining characteristic of his leadership throughout the campaign. The 1864 campaigns would prove to be pivotal in the Union's path toward victory. Grant's resolve to press on, regardless of the costs, helped wear down the Confederate Army and brought the Union Army closer to its ultimate goal, defeating the Confederacy. His leadership during this period solidified his reputation as the man who could finally bring the war to a close, regardless of the sacrifices required along the way. Part 8. The Battle of Gettysburg and the Shift in Momentum. The Battle of Gettysburg, fought from July 1 to July 3, 1863, is often regarded as the turning point of the Civil War, as it marked the first major defeat for General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia and shifted the momentum in favor of the Union. While Grant was not directly involved in this pivotal battle, its outcome had significant implications for his own military strategy and the Union war effort. The battle took place in Pennsylvania, where Lee, seeking a decisive victory on Union soil, led his army northward. His goal was to bring the war to the North, gain foreign recognition for the Confederacy, and perhaps even sway public opinion against the war in the northern states. However, Lee's invasion of the North would end in disaster, as the Union Army, commanded by General George G. Meade, successfully repelled the Confederate forces after 3 days of intense fighting. Gettysburg was a pivotal moment in the war for several reasons. The Union's victory, despite the high casualties, gave the North a much-needed boost in morale and marked the end of Lee's attempts to invade the North. In the aftermath of Gettysburg, the Confederate Army was forced to retreat back to the South, and their ability to launch further offensives on Union soil was significantly diminished. The defeat at Gettysburg represented the Confederacy's first major setback in the war, and its implications would reverberate throughout the rest of the conflict. For Ulysses S. Grant, the Union victory at Gettysburg was a significant development, as it relieved some of the pressure on his forces in the Western theater. With Lee's retreat, Grant now had the opportunity to focus more resources on his own campaigns, particularly the ones that were crucial to Union success in the South. The Confederate defeat at Gettysburg, combined with the fall of Vicksburg, ensured that the Union Army was gaining the upper hand across multiple fronts. The Union's success at Gettysburg also helped to solidify President Abraham Lincoln's commitment to Grant as the general-in-chief of all Union forces. While some had questioned Grant's leadership earlier in the war, his victories in the West, combined with the Union's success at Gettysburg, solidified his standing as the general best suited to lead the Union Army to final victory. Grant's appointment to the position of General-in-Chief in March 1864 would allow him to coordinate the Union war effort more effectively and ensure that the victories in the East and West could be brought together to defeat the Confederacy. The battle's aftermath also had a profound impact on the Confederate Army. Lee's army, which had suffered enormous casualties at Gettysburg, was forced to retreat to Virginia, where it would spend the rest of the war defending Southern soil. The loss of thousands of men, combined with dwindling resources and morale, severely hampered the Confederacy's ability to continue fighting on the offensive. While Lee was still a formidable commander, Gettysburg marked the point at which the Confederate Army could no longer mount the same kind of large-scale invasions into Northern territory. Grant's leadership, particularly during his subsequent campaigns in 1864, would build on the momentum established by Gettysburg. With Lee's army firmly in retreat and the Union's position in the West strengthened by victories at Vicksburg and Chattanooga, Grant sought to apply constant pressure on the Confederacy. His aggressive, unrelenting strategy would push Lee's army back, forcing them to fight for every inch of ground as Grant's forces closed in on the Confederate heartland. The impact of Gettysburg, though indirect in terms of Grant's immediate involvement, was a significant moment in the Union's broader war strategy. It offered Grant the opportunity to press forward with his own campaigns, knowing that the Confederacy was on the defensive and their resources stretched thin. The victory at Gettysburg helped shape the final stages of the war and was a key factor in securing the ultimate success of Grant's strategy in 1864 and beyond. As the Union moved forward, Grant's understanding of the importance of total war, the idea that the war must be fought not only on the battlefield but also through the destruction of the enemy's economic and logistical capabilities, became more pronounced. He would continue to push the Confederacy to the brink of collapse, building on the strategic victories that had begun with the Union triumph at Gettysburg. Part 9: Grant's Total War Strategy and the 1864 Wilderness Campaign. By the spring of 1864, Ulysses S. Grant had firmly established himself as the Union's most determined and capable general. As the newly appointed general-in-chief, he had consolidated his leadership over all Union armies, and his bold, relentless approach to warfare would soon come to define his campaign strategy. Rather than seeking a single decisive battle, Grant adopted the philosophy of total war, which sought to destroy the Confederacy's ability to wage war on all fronts, including its economic infrastructure, resources, and morale. Grant's leadership during the Overland Campaign of 1864 exemplified this shift in strategy. The campaign, which began in early May 1864, aimed to engage and destroy the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia under General Robert E. Lee while simultaneously placing relentless pressure on Confederate supply lines and economic resources. Grant's philosophy was simple yet brutal: to continuously engage Lee's army, deny them any chance of regrouping, and target the Confederacy's entire war-making capacity. The Overland Campaign began with the Battle of the Wilderness, fought from May 5th to May 7th, 1864, in a dense, forested area of Virginia. This was a fierce and bloody engagement, marked by confusion, disorganization, and close-quarter fighting. Both sides suffered severe casualties, and the Union forces struggled to make significant headway against Lee's well-entrenched troops. Despite the harsh conditions, Grant's resolve remained unwavering. Unlike previous Union commanders, who would retreat after suffering heavy losses, Grant pressed forward, determined to keep the pressure on Lee and his forces. Following the Wilderness, the Union Army moved southward to the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, which took place from May 8th to May 21st, 1864. In this battle, both sides again endured intense combat, and the Union forces suffered heavy losses. Grant, however, refused to back down, continuing to push Lee's army southward, not allowing the Confederates a moment of respite. Grant's refusal to retreat after the Wilderness and Spotsylvania was not only a tactical decision but a psychological one as well. He was determined to show that the Union Army would fight without pause, wearing down Lee's forces through attrition rather than seeking short-term victories. Grant's strategy during the Overland Campaign also involved simultaneous pressure on other Confederate forces in different theaters of the war. While Grant engaged Lee in the east, General William Tecumseh Sherman continued his devastating march through Georgia, capturing key cities such as Atlanta and Savannah, which further depleted the Confederacy's resources and ability to sustain the war effort. Sherman's success in the West, combined with Grant's unrelenting push against Lee in Virginia, created a dual-front pressure that the Confederacy struggled to counter. The relentless nature of the Overland Campaign wore down both armies, with casualties mounting on both sides. Grant's losses in the Wilderness and Spotsylvania were staggering, but he never hesitated to press forward. His strategy was simple. Every battle, no matter how costly, was another step toward wearing down the Confederate army and breaking its will to fight. In this approach, Grant demonstrated a key aspect of his leadership: his willingness to sacrifice for the greater good, knowing that a prolonged, attritional strategy would eventually bring the war to a close. Despite the grim toll the campaign took on his troops, Grant's refusal to accept defeat earned him the trust and respect of his commanders and soldiers. He led by example, remaining on the front lines and demonstrating his commitment to the Union cause. This steadfastness inspired his men to continue fighting even in the face of seemingly insurmountable losses. Grant's leadership was particularly evident during the Battle of Cold Harbor, fought from May 31st to June 12, 1864. In what would become one of the most controversial battles of the war, the Union launched a series of frontal assaults against entrenched Confederate positions, resulting in heavy Union casualties. Though the battle was a tactical defeat, Grant refused to retreat or abandon his strategy, once again demonstrating his resolve to achieve ultimate victory, regardless of short-term setbacks. The Overland Campaign also marked a shift in the way the Union Army operated. Under Grant's leadership, the Union Army no longer waited for favorable conditions or perfect opportunities for battle. Instead, they sought continuous engagement, even when conditions were less than ideal. Grant understood that the Confederacy's ability to replace lost soldiers and resources was diminishing, while the Union, with its larger manpower and industrial capacity, could afford the heavy casualties incurred in this relentless war of attrition. Grant's total war strategy had begun to take shape through the Overland Campaign, and it would continue to define his leadership in the final years of the war. His commitment to relentless pursuit and attrition placed significant strain on Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, while the Union's growing strength and resources ensured that the Confederacy could not keep pace. In the coming months, as Grant continued to tighten the noose around Lee's forces, the war's outcome would become increasingly clear. The Overland Campaign set the stage for the ultimate collapse of the Confederacy, with Grant's philosophy of total war pushing the Southern states to their breaking point. It was this unwavering determination and innovative approach to warfare that would eventually lead to the Union's victory and Grant's rise as one of the greatest military leaders in American history. Part 10. The Siege of Petersburg and the Struggle for the Confederacy's Heartland. After the bloody engagements of the Overland Campaign, Ulysses S. Grant's focus shifted to the Siege of Petersburg, a crucial chapter in his relentless pursuit of General Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army. The city of Petersburg, Virginia, located just south of Richmond, was a critical supply hub for the Confederate capital and the Southern war effort. Grant knew that if he could cut off the Confederacy's vital supply lines and force Lee to abandon the city, he would be one step closer to bringing the war to a decisive end. The Siege of Petersburg, which began in June 1864, was not a traditional military campaign with swift, decisive battles. Instead, it was marked by months of grueling trench warfare, as both Union and Confederate forces dug in and fought for control of key strategic points surrounding the city. Grant's forces, numbering more than 100,000 men, laid siege to the city, while Lee's Confederate Army, with fewer than 60,000 soldiers, attempted to hold the line. The two armies faced off in a protracted battle of attrition, with neither side willing to give ground. The siege itself was a war of supply lines and logistics, as the Union forces, under Grant's direction, sought to cut off the Confederate Army's access to food, ammunition, and reinforcements. Grant's strategy involved not only direct military engagements, but also targeting the infrastructure that supported Lee's army, including railroads and supply depots. The Union Army's control of these key logistical routes around Petersburg put immense pressure on the Confederacy's ability to continue fighting. Grant's forces also engaged in a series of brutal battles to capture key points around Petersburg, including the Battle of the Crater in late July 1864. The battle began with a daring Union attempt to tunnel underneath Confederate lines and detonate explosives to create a breach in the defenses. However, the Union forces failed to capitalize on the initial success, and the resulting battle turned into a disaster, with heavy casualties on both sides. Despite this setback, Grant refused to halt his siege operations and continued to tighten the noose around Lee's forces. Throughout the siege, Grant maintained a policy of relentless pressure, using his superior numbers and resources to continually attack Confederate positions, even in the face of heavy casualties. His goal was simple: to break the Confederate Army's will to fight by depriving them of supplies, manpower, and the ability to sustain their defense. As the months dragged on, Lee's army grew increasingly weaker, with desertions rising and morale plummeting. The failure of the Confederacy to break the Union siege marked a turning point, as Lee's forces were now unable to escape or resupply. The Battle of Fort Stedman, fought in March 1865, was one of the final attempts by the Confederate Army to break the siege and shift the tide of war back in their favor. Lee launched a surprise attack against Union positions, hoping to regain momentum and relieve some of the pressure on Petersburg. The attack, however, was unsuccessful, and Lee's forces were repelled with heavy losses. Grant, in contrast, used the failure to further press his advantage, launching a series of coordinated attacks that would finally bring an end to the siege. By the spring of 1865, the siege of Petersburg had dragged on for nearly 10 months, and the Confederate Army was on the brink of collapse. The combination of Grant's unyielding strategy, the mounting logistical problems faced by Lee's army, and the Union's continued dominance on the battlefield finally forced Lee to retreat from the city in early April. This marked the beginning of the end for the Confederacy as Grant's forces pushed toward Richmond, and Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was increasingly unable to defend its remaining strongholds. The fall of Petersburg was a devastating blow for the Confederacy. Richmond, the Confederate capital, soon fell to Union forces, and General Lee, realizing the impossibility of continuing the fight, began his retreat toward the south. By now, Grant's strategy of attrition, combined with his ability to coordinate operations across multiple theaters of war, had dealt a crippling blow to the Confederate Army's ability to continue the fight. Grant's success at Petersburg solidified his reputation as one of the most effective and relentless commanders of the Civil War. His refusal to allow Lee's forces any reprieve, coupled with his unwavering commitment to a strategy of attrition, ultimately led to the Confederate surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. The Siege of Petersburg, along with the broader campaigns that Grant led, marked the final phase of the war, as it ushered in the collapse of the Confederacy and the end of the Civil War. Grant's leadership in this pivotal siege showed that, when given the opportunity, he could pursue victory not through short-term triumphs, but through a sustained, comprehensive effort that wore the enemy down. Part 11. The Surrender at Appomattox and the End of the Civil War. The culmination of Ulysses S. Grant's tireless efforts in the Civil War came on April 9, 1865, when General Robert E. Lee, leader of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. This historic moment, which marked the beginning of the end for the Confederacy, was the result of a relentless pursuit by Grant's forces, combined with Lee's exhausted and defeated army. The surrender was not only a victory for the Union, but also a testament to Grant's strategy of attrition and his ability to bring the war to its long-awaited conclusion. By the time Grant and Lee met at Appomattox, the Confederate cause had already been shattered by months of intense pressure and mounting defeats. The Union Army had relentlessly pursued Lee's forces, and after the fall of Petersburg and Richmond, Lee was left with little choice but to surrender. Despite the overwhelming Union victory, Grant showed remarkable humility and magnanimity during the surrender, which would come to define his leadership during the war's final stages. The terms of surrender offered by Grant were generous and aimed at fostering reconciliation between the North and the South rather than punishment for the defeated Confederates. Grant allowed Lee's soldiers to keep their horses, as many had been used for farming and would be essential to their post-war survival. He also granted them paroles, ensuring that they would not be imprisoned or prosecuted for their service in the Confederate Army. This magnanimous gesture reflected Grant's understanding that rebuilding the nation would require unity and healing, rather than further division. Grant's treatment of Lee and his army contrasted sharply with the punitive approach that some of his contemporaries had advocated for. Many had called for the complete annihilation of the Confederate forces and their leadership, but Grant understood the importance of moving beyond vengeance to bring the nation together after the war. This display of leadership helped to set the tone for the Reconstruction era, as it emphasized reconciliation and the preservation of the Union over retribution. While Lee's surrender at Appomattox was a symbolic end to the Civil War, fighting did not cease immediately across the South. Other Confederate forces, including General Joseph E. Johnston's army in North Carolina, continued to resist the Union forces for several weeks. However, Grant's leadership and the Union Army's strategic successes had already left the Confederacy with no viable options for continuing the war. In the coming weeks, other Confederate generals, realizing the futility of further resistance, would also surrender to Grant's forces, effectively ending the war by the summer of 1865. Grant's role in bringing about the surrender was pivotal, but it was his vision and unwavering commitment to the Union's cause that ultimately led to the Confederacy's collapse. His relentless pursuit of victory, combined with his ability to manage the entire Union war effort, had turned the tide in favor of the North. By the time of Lee's surrender, Grant's military genius and strategy had already ensured that the Confederacy could not recover. Appomattox Courthouse itself became a symbol of peace and reconciliation, as the war's conclusion marked the reunification of the United States. Grant's willingness to engage in diplomacy, even with the enemy, showed that he was not merely a general focused on military victory, but also a leader concerned with the broader future of the nation. His actions at Appomattox laid the groundwork for the post-war period, where the challenge would shift from battlefield tactics to rebuilding the South and reuniting the fractured nation. Lee's surrender at Appomattox, while symbolic, did not immediately end the deep divisions between the North and South. However, it was a critical moment that signaled the Confederacy's defeat and opened the door for peace and reconciliation. Grant's leadership had been instrumental in bringing this long and bloody conflict to its final stages, and his ability to foster peace in its aftermath would be crucial to the future of the United States. With the surrender at Appomattox, Grant achieved what many had considered impossible. He had led the Union to victory, preserved the nation, and begun the process of healing the wounds of war. Grant's ability to remain calm, focused, and pragmatic in the face of monumental challenges, as well as his capacity for compassion toward the defeated South, secured his place in history as one of the greatest military leaders of all time. Part 12. The Reconstruction Era and Grant's Presidency. With the Civil War officially over, the United States entered a turbulent period known as Reconstruction, where the primary challenge was reintegrating the Southern states into the Union and rebuilding a war-torn nation. In the midst of this, Ulysses S. Grant, having risen to national prominence through his military leadership, was elected as the 18th President of the United States in 1868. His presidency would be defined by his commitment to securing the Union's victory through national healing, though it would not be without significant challenges. Grant's election came at a time when the nation was deeply divided, with the South devastated by the war and the country grappling with issues of race, civil rights, and the reestablishment of the Southern states within the Union. One of Grant's primary goals as president was to enforce the Reconstruction policies that had been established by Congress, particularly the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which sought to abolish slavery, grant citizenship to former slaves, and ensure voting rights regardless of race. Grant's administration worked tirelessly to implement these reforms, using federal power to protect the rights of African Americans in the South. The passage of the Reconstruction Amendments was a monumental achievement, but ensuring their enforcement was a more complex task. Grant supported and expanded the use of federal troops in the South to protect the newly freed slaves and enforce civil rights laws. This commitment to Reconstruction earned him praise from African Americans and Northern Republicans, but also sparked opposition from Southern whites and more conservative factions within the government. Grant's policies during this time were often marked by political friction, as he had to balance the needs of the newly enfranchised African American population with the growing discontent of Southern Democrats who sought to undermine Reconstruction efforts. Despite his dedication to civil rights, Grant faced significant resistance to these efforts, particularly from white supremacist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan's violent campaigns of intimidation and terror, aimed at suppressing African American political participation, posed a major challenge for Grant's administration. However, Grant was determined to counter these forces, and his administration passed the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871, which allowed the federal government to use military force to break up Klan activity and protect African American voters. The use of federal troops to protect the rights of former slaves marked a significant, though controversial, aspect of Grant's presidency. However, Grant's presidency was not without its scandals and controversies. The economic issues that plagued the country during Reconstruction, including a major financial panic in 1873, distracted from his efforts to complete the work of Reconstruction. The panic, which was triggered by bank failures and the collapse of the railroad industry, caused widespread unemployment and economic hardship across the nation. The financial instability, coupled with ongoing corruption scandals within his administration, cast a shadow over Grant's presidency, even as he remained steadfast in his commitment to civil rights and Reconstruction. The scandals, most notably the credit mobilier scandal, where high-ranking officials and businessmen were implicated in fraudulent practices related to the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, tarnished Grant's reputation and undermined the public's trust in his administration. While Grant himself was not directly involved in the scandals, his failure to address the corruption within his inner circle led to criticism and calls for reform. This created a sense of disillusionment among many, particularly among reform-minded Republicans who had once supported him for his military leadership. Despite these challenges, Grant's commitment to Reconstruction and civil rights remained unwavering. He worked to ensure that African Americans could participate fully in American society, even as Southern states enacted discriminatory black codes and Jim Crow laws designed to limit their freedoms. Grant's efforts laid the foundation for the civil rights movement, though the progress made during his presidency would be undone in the decades following his administration. Ultimately, Grant's legacy as president is a mixture of remarkable achievements and unfortunate setbacks. He helped to secure civil rights for African Americans, supported the abolition of slavery, and worked to create a more unified nation after the Civil War. However, his presidency was marred by corruption scandals, economic instability, and increasing opposition to Reconstruction in the South. His time in office remains a point of debate among historians, with some focusing on his admirable commitment to racial equality and others pointing to his inability to control corruption and economic turmoil. Grant's role in Reconstruction, while ultimately incomplete, had a lasting impact on the United States. He demonstrated an unwavering commitment to the preservation of the Union and the protection of civil rights, but the difficulties of Reconstruction and the challenges of post-war America made his presidency a complex and contentious period in American history. His determination to fight for African American rights would leave an enduring legacy, even if many of the gains made during his presidency would not be fully realized until the civil rights movements of the 20th century. Part 13: Grant's Second Term and the Struggles of Reconstruction. Ulysses S. Grant's second term as president, which began in 1873, was marked by the continued efforts to complete the task of Reconstruction, alongside growing political, social, and economic challenges. While Grant had succeeded in his efforts to pass landmark civil rights legislation, his second term was plagued by increasing opposition to these measures, as well as scandals that weakened his administration's effectiveness. The Republican Party, once united behind Grant's leadership, began to fracture as various factions vied for control over the direction of the nation's post-war policies. Grant's continued commitment to protecting the rights of African Americans, especially in the face of mounting resistance from the South, was a defining feature of his second term. However, by 1873, the mood in the South had begun to shift significantly, with many Southern states working to subvert the progress that had been made during Reconstruction. The rise of the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups had led to violent attacks on African Americans and Republican supporters, aiming to restore white dominance and undermine Reconstruction policies. In response, Grant and his administration passed the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871, aimed at curbing the power of the Klan and protecting the civil rights of newly freed African Americans. The acts gave the federal government the power to intervene in southern states where violence and intimidation were widespread, and also authorized the use of military force to protect African American voters and political leaders. These efforts were effective in the short term, as the federal government was able to arrest Klan members and restore some measure of order to the South. Despite these successes, Grant faced continued challenges as Southern whites resisted federal intervention, and public sentiment began to turn against Reconstruction policies. The economic downturn of the 1870s, triggered by the Panic of 1873, exacerbated political and social tensions, further diminishing support for Reconstruction in the North. Many Northerners, disillusioned by the economic struggles, began to grow weary of the ongoing military occupation of the South and the enforcement of civil rights laws. This shift in public opinion, along with political infighting and corruption scandals, ultimately undermined Grant's efforts to continue the momentum of Reconstruction. One of the most significant economic crises of Grant's second term was the Panic of 1873, a financial collapse that triggered a severe depression. The crisis was caused by overspeculation in railroads and other industries, leading to bank failures and widespread unemployment. The panic caused a major shift in national priorities, as the economic fallout led to a focus on recovery and financial stability, rather than the continuation of Reconstruction efforts. The economic hardship brought on by the panic caused many Northern Republicans to lose interest in protecting the civil rights of African Americans, shifting the focus of the government to business and economic recovery. The economic crisis also led to the rise of political movements that sought to return to a more traditional, limited government approach. This sentiment grew stronger as the 1874 midterm elections approached, with many voters increasingly rejecting the federal intervention in southern states and demanding an end to Reconstruction. As the country struggled with the aftereffects of the panic, the North's commitment to Reconstruction began to wane, and the South began to push back against the Republican control that had been enforced throughout the war years. The political fractures within the Republican Party became even more pronounced during Grant's second term. The president, who had been a war hero and a unifying figure during his first term, found himself increasingly isolated within his party. Discontent grew as scandals, such as the whiskey ring scandal, in which government officials were found to have embezzled liquor tax revenue, tarnished his administration's reputation. The perception that Grant was unable or unwilling to address corruption within his inner circle further eroded his support and weakened his political standing. Despite these setbacks, Grant remained steadfast in his commitment to Reconstruction and civil rights. However, as the end of his second term approached, it was clear that his presidency had not been able to secure lasting peace or equality for African Americans in the South. By the time Grant left office in 1877, much of the progress made during Reconstruction had been reversed, as Southern states enacted Jim Crow laws and disenfranchised African Americans through poll taxes, literacy tests, and other discriminatory measures. Grant's second term demonstrated both the difficulty of sustaining Reconstruction and the complexity of balancing national priorities during times of economic turmoil and political upheaval. Though he had succeeded in pushing through important civil rights legislation and combating white supremacy in the South, the challenges of enforcement, corruption, and economic instability ultimately limited the impact of his presidency on the long-term goals of Reconstruction. Nevertheless, Grant's legacy in his second term should not be overlooked. His tireless efforts to protect the civil rights of African Americans and ensure that the Southern states adhered to the Reconstruction amendments laid the foundation for future civil rights movements. Grant's actions, particularly in the face of overwhelming resistance, demonstrated his belief in the Union's mission to create a more just and equitable society, even if the full promise of Reconstruction was not realized during his presidency. Part 14. The Legacy of Ulysses S. Grant and the End of Reconstruction. Ulysses S. Grant's presidency, though marred by corruption scandals and economic instability, left an indelible mark on the history of the United States, especially in the context of Reconstruction and civil rights. Grant's role in the post-Civil War period remains complex, as his unwavering commitment to securing African American rights in the face of intense opposition showed a leader who believed in the promise of a more equal and united nation. However, his inability to fully complete the Reconstruction process, coupled with the growing resistance in the South, would complicate his legacy and the future of race relations in America. Grant's dedication to civil rights was perhaps most visible in his administration's efforts to protect African Americans from the brutal forces of racism and oppression in the South. The Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871, which allowed federal intervention in Southern states to combat the Klan and ensure the protection of African American voting rights, were a direct response to the violent backlash that followed the war's end. Through these laws, Grant's administration took a strong stance against white supremacy, sending federal troops to suppress Klan violence and protect newly enfranchised African Americans. However, while Grant's policies were impactful in the short term, their long-term effectiveness was undermined by the Southern states' determination to resist federal authority and restore white supremacy. The withdrawal of federal troops from the South following the contested election of 1876 and the subsequent compromise known as the Compromise of 1877 effectively ended Reconstruction, allowing Southern Democrats to regain control of local governments and enforce discriminatory laws that disenfranchised African Americans. Despite Grant's best efforts, the hard-won gains of Reconstruction were eroded in the decades following his presidency. In addition to his civil rights efforts, Grant's military legacy continued to resonate long after the war's end. His leadership during the Civil War had not only preserved the Union but also cemented his reputation as one of the most effective military commanders in American history. Grant's strategy of relentless pursuit and attrition, especially during his campaigns in the Overland Campaign and the Siege of Petersburg, was integral in bringing about the eventual defeat of the Confederate Army. His role in the surrender at Appomattox, where he exhibited magnanimity and foresight, helped pave the way for post-war reconciliation, ensuring that the country could begin the healing process and reintegrate the South into the Union. Grant's post-presidency years were less politically active, but his contributions to the national dialogue on race, war, and democracy remained significant. After leaving office, Grant continued to be involved in national affairs, especially as a champion of civil rights and African American equality. He vocally supported the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which sought to outlaw racial discrimination in public accommodations, though it would be largely ineffective due to its weak enforcement provisions. He also continued to speak out against the growing disenfranchisement of African Americans in the South and the broader abandonment of Reconstruction principles. As Grant grew older, his legacy as both a military leader and a proponent of civil rights would be reassessed in the context of the evolving political landscape of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. While he was often criticized during his time in office for his inability to curb corruption within his administration and manage the economic issues of his second term, historical assessments of his presidency have grown more favorable over time. Many historians now regard Grant as a president who understood the importance of racial equality and made significant efforts to ensure that African Americans had a place in the post-war nation. Grant's legacy is not one of a flawless presidency, but rather one of a leader who faced unprecedented challenges with a commitment to the Union's ideals. His presidency represented a period of significant upheaval and change, a time when the United States grappled with the profound consequences of the Civil War and the question of how to rebuild a nation fractured by violence and hatred. Grant's enduring commitment to Reconstruction and civil rights continues to resonate as an example of a leader who, despite his flaws, sought to build a more just America. Ultimately, Ulysses S. Grant's place in American history is one of complexity, shaped by both triumph and failure. His efforts in securing civil rights for African Americans, his leadership in the military, and his commitment to preserving the Union solidify his position as a crucial figure in the post-Civil War era. While Reconstruction fell short of its ultimate goal, true equality for African Americans, it set the stage for future struggles for civil rights, movements that would come to fruition nearly a century later. Grant's vision of a united, free nation, even if not fully realized in his time, remains a testament to his belief in the possibility of a more just America. Grant's legacy, then, is one of both unfinished business and lasting impact, leaving future generations to reflect on the profound ways in which his leadership shaped the nation's path toward racial equality and national healing. The unfinished work of Reconstruction, which he so fervently supported, would eventually be taken up again in the 20th century, giving new generations the opportunity to complete what Grant had started. Part 15: Grant's Final Years and Lasting Influence. After leaving the presidency in 1877, Ulysses S. Grant retreated from public life, though his influence and legacy continued to shape the nation long after his time in office. Despite the challenges of his presidency, including the scandals and the waning commitment to Reconstruction, Grant's role in securing the future of the Union and his efforts to promote civil rights would remain significant throughout his life. The years following his presidency were marked by personal struggles, financial difficulties, and a final attempt to reconcile his past with his enduring impact on American history. Grant's post-presidential years were marked by a series of financial setbacks, most notably his investment in a private banking firm, which went bankrupt in 1884. This failure, which left him nearly penniless, forced Grant to reconsider his future financial security. Despite his military and presidential fame, Grant's personal finances had not been properly managed, leading to a situation where he found himself deeply in debt at the end of his life. In 1884, facing mounting debts and the prospect of financial ruin, Grant took on the challenge of writing his memoirs. With the help of his friend, the writer Mark Twain, Grant worked diligently on his memoirs, which were published in 1885. The book, which recounts his military career and reflections on his presidency, became an instant success, providing Grant with a degree of financial security before his death. His memoirs, widely praised for their candidness and insight, would go on to be regarded as one of the most important works of American historical writing, solidifying Grant's place in the annals of history as both a military strategist and a leader who faced difficult challenges in his political career. Grant's death on July 23, 1885, at the age of 63, marked the end of a remarkable life that had spanned the most tumultuous period in American history. His final years, though clouded by financial ruin, provided an opportunity for him to reflect on his legacy and secure his place in history through his memoirs. In the years following his death, Grant's reputation underwent a transformation, and he came to be seen as one of the most important figures in the preservation of the Union and the fight for racial equality during Reconstruction. Grant's posthumous reputation as a military leader has continued to improve over time. His leadership in the Civil War, particularly his role in the Union's victory, is now widely regarded as a masterstroke in military strategy, and his military career is considered one of the greatest in American history. Grant's victory at Appomattox, his relentless pursuit of Lee's forces, And his strategic brilliance in the Overland Campaign are now studied by military leaders and historians alike, cementing his place among the greats of military history. In terms of his political legacy, Grant's role in Reconstruction has been reassessed positively by many scholars who now recognize his commitment to civil rights, even if the long-term results were less successful than he had hoped. While his efforts to protect African Americans in the South were undermined by the withdrawal of federal troops and the rise of Jim Crow laws, Grant's administration laid the groundwork for future civil rights movements. His fight against the Ku Klux Klan and his efforts to enforce the Reconstruction Amendments are seen as pivotal moments in the history of civil rights in America. Though Grant faced significant opposition during his presidency and was often criticized for his inability to curb corruption within his administration, his commitment to the nation's values and the preservation of the Union has earned him a place among the great American presidents. His leadership during the Civil War and his role in the Reconstruction era, though flawed, were instrumental in the preservation of the nation's democratic ideals. Today, Grant is remembered not only for his military genius, but also for his courage in the face of enormous challenges. His ability to navigate the complex political landscape of post-war America while steadfastly defending the rights of African Americans makes his legacy one of enduring importance. Grant's life and career remain a testament to the power of leadership, perseverance, and the belief in a united, equal nation, despite the obstacles that stood in his way. In the years following his death, the lessons of Grant's leadership have continued to resonate in American politics, especially in the areas of racial equality and national reconciliation. His efforts to address the wounds of the Civil War, while not entirely successful in his lifetime, laid the foundation for the civil rights struggles that would follow. His legacy is now seen as one of progress, even in the face of significant setbacks, and his contributions to the Union's victory and the protection of civil rights are among the most enduring achievements in American history. Thanks for tuning in to Historical Legacies. If you enjoyed this dive into history, please like, subscribe, and share. Join us next time for more fascinating stories from the past.